Good morning. So we have a theme going on these past few weeks. Yes, for 3 weeks now, our gospel reading has been from John chapter 6. And 3 weeks in a row, we have heard Jesus teaching the disciples and the temple priests and all who are gathered that he is the bread of life, the bread that offers eternal life. And this week we have two lovely readings also, one from the book of Proverbs and then Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And in Proverbs, we are told that wisdom, Sophia, the Spirit of God, has set a banquet for those who are simple. That's the word we use in the English translation, meaning those who love simplicity. We can imagine that there are many kinds of simplicity, certainly material simplicity, but more so spiritual simplicity. And what I imagine that this reading is pointing us to is having a simple or singular focus. That is, seeing and seeking God in all things, bringing God's love to others, especially to those in need, asking God's opinion before any other opinions. And the passage today from Proverbs finishes, lay aside immaturity and live and walk in the way of insight. Now, that seems like an oxymoron to me. Simple insight, right? Because insight implies a depth of some sort. But spiritual insight, wisdom's insight, brings us back to a simplicity of how to walk in the world. We come to the gospel, and Jesus is once again talking about bread, not peanut butter and jelly on white bread, the bread that gives life forever, the true Eucharist. And in between, another, I like to say, recipe or roadmap from St. Paul, whichever metaphor works for you. As I thought about these readings, I couldn't help but think about three of the saints that I met on my recent trip to Italy. And so I thought today, rather than just thinking about St. Paul's recipe, we could take a look at a few women who embodied those instructions, living simplicity, living with God at the center of all things. And I want to say up front that my reflection today might go a little longer than what we are used to. And I promise you, I am not going to get into the habit of supersizing my homilies. But I want to share with you just a few things about three women who received the bread of life, the Eucharist, both in its physical forms, of course, but also the deepest spiritual Eucharist that fed them throughout their lives. Chiara Alfreduccio, you can see I still have the remnants of being in Italy. Chiara was born on July 16th, 1194. Her father was a very wealthy nobleman from an ancient Roman family, and her mother also came from nobility and was a devout Catholic. At an early age, Chiara was inspired by the work and teachings of St. Francis, and she sought to enter a life of monastic simplicity, much to the chagrin of her father, who wished instead for her to be married. But Chiara persevered, left her family home to pursue a life of holiness, and when her father sent men to bring her home, they found her and she removed her head covering, and they saw that she had cut off all of her beautiful hair, a final renouncement of worldly riches. And at that point, her father gave in, and Chiara was free to pursue a life of holiness. Chiara founded the Order of Poor Ladies, a monastic religious order for women in the Franciscan tradition, and she was the first woman to write a religious rule for women. The poor ladies were cloistered, and they lived a life of manual labor and prayer. They took vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and, wait for it, silence. In her lifetime, Chiara would become a prolific writer of poetry and letters, inspiring and encouraging others, especially women, to make simple lives focused on Christ. One of her sisters took the name Agnes and joined this women's religious order just 16 days after Chiara founded it. Their mother would also join later in life after she was widowed. On September 26th, in the year 1255, just 2 years after her death in 1253, Chiara was canonized as St. Clare of Assisi. Pope Urban IV officially changed the name of the Order of the Poor Ladies to the Order of Saint Clare. And on her deathbed, Clare, or Chiara, was heard to be praying, "Go forth in peace, for you have followed the good road. Go forth without fear, for he who created you has made you holy, has always protected you, and loves you as a mother. Blessed be you, my God, for having created me." Clare was buried deep under the altar of the old basilica in Assisi, and after almost 600 years, her body was exhumed and found to be incorrupt. And in 1872, her relics were transferred to a shrine in the crypt of the building that is today the Basilica of St. Clare, where pilgrims can still go down into the basement and honor and venerate her. Margaret of Cortona was born in 1247 in a small farming village in Tuscany. Her mother died when she was young, and that event had lifelong ramifications as her father remarried a woman who did not embrace Margaret. As a teenager, she fell in love with a young man from a noble family who did not approve of her. She became his mistress and bore him 2 children out of wedlock, one who died very early in childhood. The other would grow to adulthood and join the Franciscans. Margaret faced another turning point in her life when her lover was murdered, forcing her into a period of deep prayer and also penitence. She and her young son found shelter with 2 women in Arezzo after being turned away by Margaret's family. She suffered from great guilt and committed acts of just terrible self-mutilation and asceticism. But it seems as though one confessor in her life had a particular impact in stopping Margaret from irreparable self-harm and restoring her to a place of self-care. Eventually, becoming more whole, becoming healed from her own wounds, she began to care for young children and sick women. She modeled her life on the way of the Franciscans and was received into the Third Order of St. Francis. Through deep prayer, she experienced a mystical union with Christ. She established a hospital to serve the poor, the homeless, the impoverished, and she also went on to establish a congregation and an order of religious women devoted to Our Lady of Mercy, with members pledging themselves to support the hospital and to help the needy. In 1288, Margaret retreated to a life of solitude and prayer within the walls of a falling down church and remained there until her death. The people of Cortona proclaimed her a saint immediately upon her death, though official canonization would take another 400 years. By 1330, the people of Cortona, whom she had served throughout her adult life, had constructed a new basilica at the Acropolis of Cortona, which, if you've never been there, is like a hill like this. And in 1456, her body was exhumed and also declared incorrupt. Pilgrims who can make an almost 30-minute vertical climb up the mountain can pray with Margaret in her final resting place. And she was officially canonized by Pope Benedict XIII in 1728. 100 years later, Caterina Benincasa was born on March 25th, 1347, in Siena. Her mother was the daughter of a local poet, and her father was a businessman, a cloth dyer. Caterina was, ladies, hang on, the 23rd of 26 children, and her twin sister, Giovanna, died in infancy. Caterina had her first vision of Christ when she was 5 or 6 years old, and by the time she was 7, declared that she would dedicate her life to Christ. Unsurprisingly, her medieval parents wished for her to marry, but as a teenager, she went on food fasts and cut off all her hair, and her parents relented. In the early years of her dedicated life, Caterina stayed as a hermit, cloistered in her family home. But Christ came to her in a mystical encounter and told her that he needed her to be out in the world. She tried to join the Third Order Dominicans in Siena, but they only took widows. But Caterina was not deterred. She was nothing if not stubborn and persistent, and she wore down those old widows until they allowed her to join them. Caterina had many mystical encounters with Christ, including a beautiful mystical marriage between her and Jesus, with his hand given in marriage by his own mother, Mary. One of the most prolific theologians in church history, Caterina often wrote about the crucified blood of Christ and even described a mystical encounter in which she drank from his wounded side in a deeply Eucharistic and maternal act of spiritual nourishment, Christ as mother. Caterina undertook many acts of charity, caring for the sick, praying with and accompanying prisoners to their death, prayer and service. Prayer and service. She wrote thousands of letters, about 400 of which we still have today, exhorting people to return to the gospel. Kings, queens, bishops, no one was safe from her attention. She received the stigmata of Christ, but at her request, it was only visible to others after her death. And in one of the greatest political acts in church history, she traveled to Avignon and is credited with persuading Pope Gregory XI to return to Rome. Caterina died in 1380 at a very young age of 33 due to extreme asceticism in the form of fasting. She was canonized in 1461, declared a patron saint of Rome in 1866 and of Italy, along with St. Francis in 1939. She was the second woman to be named a doctor of the church in 1970, and in 1999, Pope John Paul II proclaimed her a patron saint of Europe. These few weeks of thinking about the bread of life and what happens when we take in the bread of life and allow it to nourish our whole selves, our whole lives, had me remembering the sacred time I spent less than a month ago with these extraordinary medieval holy women. Women who chose simplicity of spirit, who made Christ their sole focus, who found their meaning in loving others as they were loved by him. Their strength of spirit, their clarity of purpose has something to teach us even to this day. Certainly, when we receive the bread of life, that does not mean that life will be without challenge or struggle or hardship, but it does mean that life will never be without God. I love the saints. I love these women. I am honored to be their spiritual goddaughter. But I know that I am not called to be Claire or Margaret or Catherine. None of us is. But we are called to receive the bread of life and allow it to nourish us to greater love, to find our strength, use our agency in the name of his love. These holy disciples and others like them, they want to accompany us as we discern how we can choose simplicity of spirit and become the bread of life for others. When we were in Italy and we visited each of the churches where they are buried, we saw pilgrims in every place praying with these beloved holy women, these women who still guide, still support, pray with us and for us. This is the communion of saints. What a blessing. May your week be blessed with moments of deep simplicity of spirit and even deeper nourishment from the meal that we are about to share together, inspiring you to ever greater closeness with the one who loves us. Amen.